Welcome everyone to the GCSJ seminar series, and we are delighted to have Bev Orton today with us. We've been trying to, set up a seminar with Bev for a while now, and so we're glad that we've managed to find a time that works. Bev will be presenting today on marginalised and stigmatised sex work should not cost my life. And it's this presentation is based on ongoing work. Bev's an associate lecturer and a research fellow at the University of Hull and an associate lecturer within the Open University.
I'm going to be talking about something that is, I've been researching and working on for quite a while. And so I just wanted to say, which is something I always say to my students, I say to them, I myself am not a sex worker. And then, I mean, some people here might know this, but I say to them, I continue to say, I'm not a sex worker, but if I was, you wouldn't be able to afford me. So, yeah, but I've been working on this with sex workers for quite a while in South Africa. And as part of a big research grant, which we got, and that started the whole issue to do with decriminalisation of sex work in South Africa. So it's what I find is there's a great need for safeguarding of sex workers in South Africa, which is something that I'm working on here in the UK. So these are the organizations that I work with, Asajiki, Sweat and Sisonka, and they do amazing work in South Africa, providing holistic care for sex workers. So the sad thing is that the rate of murders of sex workers is very, very high, but very much invisible. But they, Sweat and Sikalili and Sisonka, they amplify the work of sex workers. This is what they try to do, and to create a unified community. So in South Africa, you have a woman is killed every 4 hours. Some research says 3 hours, but it's basically, I think, for every 4 hours, every 3 hours, definitely, and 4 hours, that's what they're coming up with. So in the past 2 years, you have 101 female and trans women sex workers have died in South Africa, many before the age of 40, and 45% of those deaths are murders. So you can see the high number of murders, people, women are dying because of the work that they're doing. And approximately 400 sex workers were killed between 222 and 223. And those are the ones that we know about. There are many, many, many that we do not know about. Women are not missed. They're migrant women. They come to South Africa. They work as sex workers. Nobody knows that they're here, and then they disappear. Nobody knows where they are. This is a poem by Yahanda, and Yahanda was a South African trans woman and HIV and a cancer survivor, as well as a survivor of child exploitation and sex trafficking. And she was murdered in 2019 at the age of 37. She was a chairperson of Sweat, and she was an advocate for transgender people, sex workers, and the decriminalisation of sex work, which I will come on to later. So you can see, it doesn't matter who or what positions you hold. These are, she lay in her room, having been murdered by the person that she lived with, and she lay there for quite some time. So this is her poem, and I am a wonder, therefore I've been born by a mother. As I begin to suffer, my life has been no other. She's born in pain and she's nourished by rain, and for me to gain was living in a drain. So you can see the hurt and the pain that Ayanda suffered. Let me just do the next one. So through, as I say, through the work that they do, they amplify the voices of the sex workers, and they try to, kind of move the issues of stigma away from sex workers, and reintegrate sex workers into communities so that they're free from discrimination, from stigma, and as I say, the very strong. Okay, let me just. I got this. let me just do this where we go. Okay, here we go. Here we go. This is when I was in South Africa as part of this great of this grant that we got. We formed the first sex workers theatre in the world, basically. And this is a clip from some of the work that we did. But I'm going to show all the clips at the end if we can, if we can get there, if we can manage that. So to start this, South Africa is like a boiling pot of all sorts of different cultures and histories and her stories. So I just want to give you a little brief kind of her story, in that sex work in South Africa is deeply entrenched within her story of colonialism and also of post-colonial politics. And sex work is as old as civilization, but in South Africa it is criminalized. It is actually it's illegal. So during the colonial period, the sex workers often achieved economic autonomy. They managed to make money from the people who were coming around, and from the colonialists, and they were able to send money back home to their families who lived then in the rural areas. So these sex workers came in to Cape Town to kind of work and then send money back to their families where they were living. And, in 1795, sorry, the British occupied the Cape Colony. And then you have the Contagious Diseases Act. And this was a series of 3 laws. And the aim of the laws was basically to stop the spread of venereal disease among the British armed forces by examining sex workers or suspected sex workers, and because they were seen as the source of all this illness. So you can see here the blame game has already started many, many years ago. And then you have the Contagious Act of 1885, and then this also called for the registration and the regulation of sex workers. But once again, nothing about the clients. It's all to do with the sex workers. It's all their fault. Okay, it's everything. They are to blame for everything. And in Cape Town, there were very many visiting ships who frequented the nightclubs and the dives in Cape Town, and which were near the harbour, and they catered specifically for the sailors. So you've got the country's very, very violent history of colonialism and racial segregation and the militarization. And this is entrenched, very much entrenched within the sexual violence in white and black communities. So there's a lack of historical research into available evidence that kind of establishes this kind of violence across South Africa's racial and class groups prior to and during apartheid. So there's all these issues that one needs to take on board. And then let me just, here we go. And then a very sad example of this is the Hottentot Venus, Saartjie Baartman. Because you've got the colonial logic which constructed the black woman as being hypersexual and licentious, and therefore and impossible to rape. You couldn't rape them because raping them does not count on them. It doesn't count. So because of their so-called perceived hypersexuality. So you've got World War II, and you've got the spread of sexually transmitted infections amongst the European troops and in Africa. So so once again, regulation, sort of like coming down on the sex workers, because like it's all their fault. Okay, so we need to criminalize the sex workers, and this underpin the human abuses against the sex workers. And raping was permissible. It was permissible to rape sex workers. So what was the aim of all this regulation and the aim of all these laws and ways of thinking was actually to get the absolute total eradication of sex work. So you've got the thinking that led to the institutionalization of rape against Black women by white men, and then you get the broader devaluing of Black women's bodies and humanity that facilitate this interracial rape. And the structure of violence of apartheid through the labor migration, forced removals, and led to an increase in infidelity, jealousy, and domestic violence, and the new masculinities. and ways of controlling women. So, this is why I've gone back to a bit of her story about South Africa, because all of this impacts what is happening on women today in South Africa, the violence that's being perpetuated on women's bodies today. So we've got here, what is it about South Africa? South Africa's sex work is fully criminalized, absolutely criminalized. And this includes both the selling of and the buying of sex and the benefiting of the proceeds of commercial sex. All right. So you've got there, but this has led to human rights violation of sex workers. They're not protected by law enforcement, and the violence, committed against sex workers by the police is very, very it's quite immense. It's strong. It's something that we're looking at dealing with at the moment. So you've got harassment, you've got arbitrary arrests, you've got violation of procedures and standing orders, and very inhumane conditions of detention. And this is also reflected in the issues of when we detained apartheid, women fighting against apartheid. These kind of issues kind of perpetuate within that as well, the way the police looked at women activists, but that's another story. Okay, so South Africa's social political her story has furthered and normalized a culture of violence and equality. It's kind of ingrained within society at the moment. And what we have with female sex workers is, number one, very, very few have completed high school education. Is not very high. The households that they have are very food insecure, and they are living in households which are in poverty, living in shacks within the townships. So as wives and mothers, it falls on us to make the small wages go a long way. It's the women's sort of lot to kind of look at these monies that are being brought into the families and making them go a long way. They need to care for the children. They need to provide for the children. They need to look after the children when they're hungry and sick. They need to clean the houses, keep them clean. They need to be available for husbands when they come back from the mines and from the farms and in the towns, and they know what it's like to keep families going. So these harsh working conditions and in poverty falls upon the women, because the men have gone to work on the mines, or they're here or they're there, and the women are left to care for everything. So, but at the end of the day, the women are treated as minors. They're treated as minors within the marriages and within the property laws, okay? And as unmarried women and widows and divorcees, they have to fend for themselves. These large number of women, this amazing amount of women who are so resilient and so able to find ways of providing for families, to becoming the breadwinners of their families. And one of the ways they do that is to do sex work, which is very, very high risk. And then, of course, you have the issue with stigma. Stigma is something that is a label that has very, very, very far-reaching effects on women. Okay, and Sweat characterizes that the South African commercial industry is comprising of about 130,000 to 180,000 sex workers that we know about. 90% are female, and 10% are male or transgender. But poverty in South Africa is highly, highly feminized, and women are shouldering the main majority of the issues, as I've said before. This informal sex that women have, that sex workers are doing in South Africa, is basically called survival sex. It's sex to enable them to survive. So they will have sex enabled to make money for food, to make money to pay for the children's clothes, to pay for school fees, and those sort of things. And the stigma that prevents them from accessing support from healthcare centers and from their families, because from their families and their communities, they have to hide that they're sex workers. They have to hide it because if somebody finds out that they're sex workers, they will be ostracized and maybe kicked out of that community. One of the sex workers I worked with, she was doing sex work in order to provide her daughter with with an education. So she used to send her mother, where her daughter was living with her mother, she used to send her mother money in order to pay for education, in order to pay for clothes, in order to look after, and feed her daughter. And then one day somebody at the daughter's school found out her mother was a sex worker, and this led to a rather devastating situation for the daughter. So let me just go here. Oh, here we are. Here we are. So you can see that, as sex workers and stigma, what does it do? What does it do to you? It means that you have your self-perception, your identity is manifested in shame and self-blame, and you have, you think you have a loss of social value and social withdrawal. And not only that, but because you're known as a sex worker, you face terrible threats of to your well-being, but also threats to your life. And this makes you amazingly vulnerable, very, very vulnerable, and also affects your mental health. So there are many of the sex workers do have severe mental health issues. And you have internalized sex stigma, which is, it's ingrained within your body. Okay. So yeah, so you've got, well, you're a sex worker, you're going to die in 3 months, so there's nothing more we can do for you. I have a waiting room full of people who are not morally corrupt like you, and then they sent the sex worker home. So you can see that sex workers in South Africa are not able to access any proper health care, are not able to go and see the healthcare workers, the doctors, because of the stigma that is attached to them. So they suffer abuse not only from society as such, but but also from their clients, where they suffer abuse and physical harm, and then, as I said, sometimes death. So the whole thing about making sex work and decriminalizing sex work and the illegality of sex work in South Africa makes sex work in South Africa extremely risky, and also lends itself to organized crime and trafficking syndicates, which are a problem in South Africa, because the sex workers have nowhere to go to report the crimes that are being made against them. And they are vulnerable because they are targeted and they are arrested rather than protected. Sorry. So on the next slide, you can see, even though a man raped me and stole my cell phone, what happens? I'm more frightened of the police than I am of that man. And that is a very frightening sort of statement. And it kind of says everything, excuse me, that the sex workers are feeling about the police. So the police and the sex workers have what is known as a very adversarial relationship. And it's adversarial with the police and law enforcement. And because the sex workers face a high level of risk, not only from clients and communities, but also from the police. They cannot go to the police for protection. It's impossible. Okay. And this is because they do not feel safe reporting their victimization to police. Why? Because police sexual violence is perceived to be widespread and it's underreported. Nobody is taking this up. There was a certain police officer who was looking at this issue and trying to deal with this issue, and he was murdered. Okay. We don't want this kind of thing looked at. We want to keep it quiet. Okay. So you've got law enforcement in South Africa, and they justify their actions because they say sex workers are criminals and they're responsible for the degradation of societal morality. And they face, sex workers face violence from all sorts of various sources. And the thing about the police is the police believe the myth that a sex worker cannot be raped. Sex workers cannot say no, and they deserve to be abused, and basically that they asked for it. So this means that sex workers are less likely to carry condoms because they are, when the police find them and they find the sex workers with condoms, they say, okay, you are a sex worker. So just think about it. Everybody, anybody here who's listening, if ever you've carried condoms on you, and somebody stops you, and just because you have a condom doesn't mean to say you're a sex worker, okay? But that's what happens in South Africa. So it is, they're marginalized. They have no little or legal protection from the police, and they cannot go to the police because it's the police that are marginalizing them, that are being violent against them. And the police, they force them to pay fines. They use bylaws, and they bribe the sex workers so that the police will not arrest them. And then sometimes when the police take away and demand confiscate the condoms, what they do then is they demand unprotected sex from the sex workers. So you can see the attitude of the police towards the sex workers. It is very unnerving, and it's fueled by stigma and adversity. And the number of police officers utilize this form of thinking to justify their rape and their sexual assault of sex workers. And and secondly, police officers themselves rape and exploit sex workers directly. So how can sex workers go and report issues of rape or sexual assault to the police officers? They will not be they will not be they will not be believed at all, and maybe they will be raped again by the sex workers, by the police when they are put in the cells. Okay. So when I get into the police car, the police start touching my genitals. They say they want sex. If I refuse to give free sex, they will then arrest me and put me in a police cell. So rape is the most rape tends to be the most frequent instance of police sexual violence, which is then followed by sexual assault and sexual harassment. 99% of the police officers who were in the research who engaged in police sexual violence incidents are male. 92 of the victims were female. And as I said before, they put them into dirty cells, force them to have sex with them, and rob them of their possessions. They've also known to kick and punch sex workers. In one case, the sex worker was kicked so violently that during detention that her internal organs were damaged to such an extent that she was nearly killed. And invisibility in death is also something that is not researched, and it's increased because sex work is criminalized. And this has a serious impact on how cases are recorded by authorities and how sex worker deaths are perceived by society. So the sex worker is kind of encased in this in this bubble of total stigma, harassment, violence, and they have actually nowhere to go with this hurt and with this uh, uh, with the feelings that they have. That where do they go? Where do they turn? Who do they turn to? And this is where the organizations come in. Sweat, Sisonke, Azikili. This is where they come in. They to help them and to try and support them, and and do advocacy work on their behalf. And one of the sex workers who had been raped by the police, she said if it hadn't been for Sweat being with her and going through the whole process, they wouldn't have got a positive outcome. But it is something that is very difficult for a sex worker to do. So the rights of sex workers who are arrested and detained are not upheld, and in some cases, as I said before, the police engage in these criminal actions themselves because they say, they're enforcing the law. It is criminal. It is criminalized. We're doing the law. Okay. So what happens when you have police power? Police power takes away the dignity of the sex worker. It's a very big power imbalance, as you kind of get the idea, right? And exposes the sex worker to gender-based violence. So the failure of the police is that they do not recognize the human rights of sex workers. They don't think a sex worker has human rights. They're arrested arbitrarily, even while shopping, because they know me, so they will arrest me. I'm not doing sex work. I'm in a shop. I'm buying stuff, but they will arrest me. Why? Because they know me, okay? And they'll just arrest me. So a sex worker can be arrested just because of being known to be a sex worker, okay, or suspected of being a sex worker. So according to Asakiri, even when police arrest sex workers lawfully, what happens is they use unnecessary force, they use handcuffing, they control them physically and put them in jail. And they make this issue very, 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 very stressful and are completely unnecessary, because sex workers themselves are not really violent. They're not going to, how can a sex worker who is very vulnerable take on this this policeman who's out there, this officer out there to get them? This, so we've got here some cases. I think this comes on next. Yeah, you got, she was when I escaped, I got on with my life. I didn't have skills. There's got no money to find work, no money for transport. The third day of doing sex work, I could send money home. So you can see, yeah, Dudu, who's an amazing woman who works with Sweat, she got into sex work for various reasons, and she was able to look after her family. All right. So what happens when a sex worker, I'm just going a bit ahead of myself here. So yeah, these are some of the cases. Now, one of the thing about these cases are that it takes so long to come to court. It takes very, very long to come to court to get a judgment, right? So when something does happen and there is something is found out and there is a result and there is a sentence, it is actually very remarkable. It is something that is really, really people are really, really happy about, because it is so far and few between. So safety for sex workers can be improved by, better lighting, maybe increased police presence in areas where they work. But that is an issue if you have trust. Sex workers need to trust the police. And at the moment, the trust of police is nil. It doesn't exist. Okay. So so the criminalization of sex workers, I've said before, links very, very much to the human rights violations. And you've got here, so you've got the Sex Worker Education and Advocacy Task Force, SWET. When the judgment was handed down by the Western Cape High Court on 29th of April, the double murder accused Johannes de Jager, they found him guilty of murdering and raping Hiltina Alexander, a sex worker. But you can see how long it took 13 years, to spend more than 13 years researching, and doing, and how, it just takes ages and ages and ages to find and to get to a result. So in 2008, the case was. In 2014, you have the judgment. So you can see how long it takes to get there. And the issue with poverty is, sex workers and poverty. This is, the feminization of poverty. They become sex workers. Why? To provide not only for their own children, but the children of their brothers, their sisters, for their mothers. They're looking after their mothers, their brothers, their fathers, all sorts of members of their family. And even though selling sex is dangerous, they're still out there doing this because they know that there's nobody else, nobody else supporting, their families, their children, their immediate families, and immediate and other members of their families. So when a sex worker dies, their family loses their breadwinner, okay, and there's no claim for compensation. And this echoes the findings that often the sex workers have been the sole earner of money within their family. So this is I'd like to show this at the end of the talk. So we need to think about, contemporary policing. We need to think about moving away from this way of policing that is so oppositional and so violent. So we think that, so in 2016 there was a movement to move away from this, and they commissioned a research report on sex work and contemporary policing in South Africa. So it was a way to look at collaboration, innovative partnerships, and the capacity building. It was a way of looking at a collective decision to kind of move away from this into a more positive policing partnership, to drive a more collaborative, solution-based and focused model of engagement, and a more active, positive action on behalf of the police towards sex workers. Okay. But it is very, very, very clear from talking to Asakili and from the research that's happening. So 2017, we have this, let us have a collaborative movement, let us have a collaborative approach, let us move away from this traditional way of policing, which is like harsh and violent towards sex workers. Let us move away towards a more collaborative way of looking at things. But it is clear that none of the above has been achieved. And today we're sitting in 2026. So Asakili, as I spoke to them yesterday, they said that regarding positive policing partnership, we can confirm that unfortunately policing practices towards sex work has remained largely unchanged. It's not happening. And reports from the ground continue to point out to ongoing brutality, harassment, and the lack of meaningful implementation of the recommendations that emerged from that process, which is so sad. I mean, it's just devastating. So, and it's not only the male police officers, there's also female police officers harassing sex workers. She's violent, she beats up sex workers and insults them for no apparent reason. And, as a sex worker, I face so many challenges due to police brutality. For me, it's something normal to be raped by a policeman, as they usually did. So we have the call, let's decriminalize sex work and the industry as a whole. Let's decriminalize it. And so we can recognize human rights and treat sex workers with dignity. So the decriminalization of sex work in South Africa gets rid of these offences such as loitering and a public nuisance, and that it enables safer work environments and safer, for unions. We'd have safer employment regulation, and it would prevent the police from targeting sex workers during their police operations. Now, I know that decriminalization of sex work gets certain people's backs up. And it's moral, it's religious, it's political. We can't do this. If we have decriminalization of sex workers, everybody's going to go to a sex worker. Well, excuse me, a lot of people are doing it already, okay? And the sex workers are not being protected, okay? They're not being protected, and there's a whole issue of socio-political issues, especially in South Africa, encompassing the sex workers that has been going on for years and years and years. The her story, colonialism, apartheid, during apartheid, after apartheid, and it's still there. It's still there. There's no protection for these women and these men and transgender. Okay, so if we kind of work for a national police of sex work a framework and a standard operating procedures, what we could be looking at is the criminalization of sex work means that the working conditions for sex workers could be improved. Okay, we also the sex workers will be able to feel that they are able to report violence to the police, because the police will not be violent towards them the whole way. This would be changed because sex work would not be criminalized. Therefore, the police, their way of thinking about sex workers would be different. They would work more openly in in well-lit places, in legal brothels, or in their own homes, and it would reduce the stigma and the discrimination. It would make them less likely to be attacked. Okay. They would be able to negotiate, the issue of the condoms. I mean, why take condoms away? You're taking the condoms away, you're increasing STIs, HIV, and various other, various other issues. They would have services. They'd be able to go and get services at the healthcare centers and not be stigmatized and mocked and persecuted. So good policing comes from police being trusted by the community. If the community do not trust the police, then you have this hostile environment. Sex workers need to trust the police, and that is something that needs to be worked on really, 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 really quickly, basically, and really soon. Because if how can you report violence if you're a woman to the police, if you're just known as a sex worker, and that you're going to be treated more violently if you do report this? So there's the call for, as I said before, for decriminalization of sex work is very loud, and it's urgent, because it'll stop the labor exploitation and the discrimination, the arbitrary arrest, and the violence, and it provide a platform for safer safer working conditions and better health outcomes. Okay. So, the positive policing partnership strategies would be really, really good. I mean, it would be something that could be put in place, and it would be, it would foster mutual engagement and commitment. The activists for sex workers, they are very strong about decriminalization, and not all the Nordic models and all the other models that are around, because it would, get rid of so many discriminatory practices. It would, very, very importantly, it would make stronger engagement between the South African police force, government, and sex workers and the advocacy organizations. It would empower sex workers to understand their rights. Okay, because at the moment they feel they have no rights. They feel that they are nothing. They feel that they're just there. They're rubbish, because that's what the way people think of them. And they could, it's decriminalizing adult sex work between consensual adult sex work would provide a much needed clarity on various issues. And sex workers would not be exploited by criminals, by trafficking and the law enforcement. And it would enable sex workers not to feel so vulnerable. Um, and it would encourage sex workers to report incidents, and they would not be discouraged from doing so. And it would reflect, on their lives. It would enable them to, because of the issue of poverty, it might just enable more engagement, not only with police officers and police, but also with educational issues. And with the organizations that I work with, they are working towards teaching the sex workers key skills. They learn various, it is a place where mothers can come together with their children. There's a creche, and this is what is needed, absolutely what is needed in improving policing and in decriminalization of sex work. So yeah, and it would also, healthcare would mean reduce issues of AIDS and SITs and HIV. It would also increase the women's power to negotiate, their with their clients, and it would also reduce their risk of violence and rape, because they would be able to work in areas that are better suited, and not in not dark places and in dark bushes and away from everywhere, because this is where the clients find them, but also hiding from police. They hide in the bushes, all sorts of places, so that they can't be found. So by decriminalizing sex work totally, you are prioritizing harm reduction, and you're involving the sex workers. And this is important, you're involving the sex workers in policy development, and you're collaborating with other stakeholders, and therefore you're moving towards a more just and equitable approach to sex work. So I know when you talk about decriminalization of sex work, heckles go up, bristles, I should say, bristles go up. And, it just brings out all sorts of things. But sex work has been going on for many, 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 many years. It's blamed for many, 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 many things. And sex workers in South Africa are mainly doing it to support their family, to support their children, to buy clothes, to get them education. Quite a few sex workers have managed to pay for their children to go to university, to get a university education. It's not just, you don't just wake up one morning and think, gosh, I want to be a sex worker. No, it is a very high risk job. It is very, very high risk. And it's work. Sex work is work. You go out there, and you hope you come back in the morning, and you hope you come back alive, and you hope you come back not having been treated violently. So I hope that just gives you a little flavor of what's happening in South Africa with sex workers. And I'm working with them continually. I'll be back in Cape Town again this year, and we're working with the South African Sex Workers Theatre Group, and we'll be working on a new production. And yeah, it is hopefully an ongoing process. And I consider myself very, very fortunate to be working with these organizations and with the sex workers, who I think they're just amazing women and men and trans women. And thank you for listening.